Before his name disappeared from the records, a farmer made a decision so brutal that he erased his own lineage. A lineage that, for more than 160 years, was whispered only in ink-stained archives. Content warning. This episode deals with coerced reproductive exploitation, sexual coercion, and suicide. Some viewers may find the material distressing. The farmer who gave his wife to his enslaved men ended his lineage. The silenced ritual of 1861. On a ridge where mist gathers at dawn, a house kept accounts of human lives the way other households kept silverware, measured, ordered, and never questioned in public. In one column, names. In the next, dates and brief judgments. In the margins, instructions that would reach into bedrooms and alter futures. That ledger, a narrow browned book with ink bleeding where fingers had been hurried, is one of the few things that survive to tell parts of this story. Presented as the local scandal of 1861 in the title, the surviving primary records consulted for this investigation date primarily to 1864 through 1866. Where the documentary record is silent or inconsistent, we mark those moments indefinito. Where later recollections intervene, we identify them as such. Primary sources and further reading are listed in the description below. Check the links there to view the documents for yourself. San Sebastian sits along a low ridge in the agrarian corridor that fed regional markets and local reputations alike. Land and lineage were not merely private concerns. They were the currency of status. Estates were measured in cattle and children, in the ability to pass name and title from one generation to the next. For men of property, the absence of a male heir threatened not just inheritance, but social identity. In the language of the day, anxieties about bloodlines and honor could become administrative problems to be solved. At the center of the archival traces is Colonel Ostoto Ferreira da Costa. The name appears in municipal records, tax lists, and not least, in correspondence with the steward who managed the daily operations of his estate. Variant spellings turn up repeatedly in scans and handwritten marginalia. Ostoto, Osto, sometimes a contraction of the family name. A reminder that the past arrives to us through imperfect ink and human hands. He was, by the yardstick of his peers, a man of influence. Municipal office recorded alongside his surname. Ledgers showed lands under his management. Social registers placed the Ferreira da Costa household among the region's elite. Opposite him in the fragile entries is a woman whose name the records preserve. Dona Esperanza Ferreira da Costa. The registers show her in the social column, attested by godmother lists and domestic inventories where linens and silver thread are itemized. The documents also bear traces of what the household did not, recurring notations of pregnancies that did not result in lasting heirs, deliveries that ended in loss. The language of the day skirts around some things. Midwife notes and parish marginalia record dates and outcomes without commentary. Together, they sketch a repeated failure to produce the secure male successor the colonel desired. The operation, as it can be reconstructed from scattered archival fragments, was not improvisation. It bore hallmarks of calculation, ledgers, schedules, physician assessments, and the managerial oversight of a steward who reported to the colonel. The affair became, in effect, bureaucratized. 7 men are listed in connection with the household's reproductive program. Their names survive in ink. Cristomo, variant spellings, Crostimo, Joan Crostimo, identified in steward's notes as a groom and skilled in horse care. Miguel dos Santos, also Miguel Dantos, recorded in work rolls as a younger field worker with a quick laugh. Antonio da Silva, named in masonry ledgers and valued for his strength and craft. Pedro Gonzalez, a cook's helper whose knowledge of plants appears in marginal remedies. Francisco de Asis, an elder and storyteller whose name surfaces in later recollections. Jose Maria, noted in the Stewart's ledger as a refuser, and Luis Carlos, described in a later register as gentle and caregiver. The files preserve them as labor categories and short descriptors, but the accounts and oral traces ask us to see more than a row in a book. Each man carried skills, relationships, fears, and strategies of survival that do not fit neatly into columns. Dr. Henrique, recorded in the physician's ledger and likely the man identified in family papers as Dr. Henrique Almeida, makes repeated appearances in the medical marginalia. The physician's pages list brief physical assessments next to names, sometimes signed with a blotted initial. Words such as sound or fit appear in places where the handwriting is legible. In other spots, the ink is smudged and the sense of the note is indefinito. Whether the physician considered himself merely a professional executing orders, or whether he was an active participant in a plan that treated bodies as instruments for lineage, is a question the documents cannot answer directly. They do, however, show that medical knowledge was enlisted to certify physical capacity, and, by implication, to facilitate the scheme. The Stewart's ledger is the clearest artifact of the household's logistical imagination. Where financial accounts record purchases and labor allocations, another set of entries documents mites, rotations, and a small, curtained house behind the main residence, described in Stewart's notes as the back house. The back house is named in inventories and appears repeatedly in the Stewart schedule as the place, narrow, private, often fogged with secrecy, where certain domestic arrangements were to occur.
The steward's handwriting, businesslike and terse, pairs names with dates and brief verbs, attend, assess, and, in at least one line later noted by the municipal clerk, refused. That solitary verb, written next to the name Jose Maria, is one of the few recorded acts of refusal in the documents. It stands out because most entries proceed as if purpose and performance were interchangeable. We must be explicit about what the sources show and what they do not. The ledgers indicate a program of selection and scheduling. The physician's notes indicate assessments. The midwife's entries indicate births and baptisms. Where the files are silent, the colonel's private conversations, promises of manumission, specific threats, the record is indefinito. Oral testimonies collected decades later speak to some of those private dimensions, but these are memory fragments and must be treated as recollection rather than contemporaneous proof. They are nonetheless vital. They are what fills the thin spaces of the archive with human feeling. Imagine the back house at night, a small structure separated from the formal rooms of the main residence. In the steward's ledger, it is functional, noted as a place to receive on certain dates. Its physical description in household inventories is spare: a bed, a lamp, a folding screen, but the place was not only furniture and walls. For the enslaved men and for Dona Esperanza, it was a scene of imposed proximity and constrained choices. The language of the archive circumscribes what they did not name: coerced reproductive arrangement, forced reproductive exploitation, and the instrumentalization of bodies under the authority of an owner. Those phrases are the closest descriptive instruments the historian can use without eroticizing or minimizing the violence that the documents imply. Resistance appears in the record as both explicit refusal and quiet subversion. The steward's ledger records Jose Maria's refusal plainly. The notation is terse but direct. In later oral testimony, collected in the latter decades of the 20th century, older voices from the quarter remember songs sung at night whose verses were deliberately ambiguous, not about the household, but about dignity and the future. Francisco de Asis, whose name appears in the ledgers as an elder and storyteller, later recalled the significance of marks carved into bedposts, not as decoration, but as a code of presence. These are recollections recorded in 1978 and cataloged as oral testimony in an archive of community memory. Such recollections cannot prove the sequence of events in precise detail, but they tell us how those who lived there understood what was happening and how they sought to retain some measure of agency. The steward's ledger also used incentives and administrative levers. Several entries show small adjustments in rations at times coinciding with scheduled rotations. Other marginal notes reference favor or status, but the handwriting is evasive, and the exact promise, whether extra bread, liberty in tasking, or future consideration, remains indefinito. Equally indefinito is any recorded contract that offered manumission in exchange for compliance. The files do not present an explicit written bargain. It is important to mark this absence precisely. Absence of the written promise does not mean absence of coercive pressure, but it does mean the historian cannot assert formal bargains without evidence. Medicalization of the enterprise appears as a recurrent theme. The physician's ledger offers a chilling ordinariness. Short lines assessing men's physical health as though organizing plantation labor, not human intimacy. The physician's notes sometimes appear alongside notations that suggest testing for soundness, a word in one margin at least, and in another place, the doctor recorded the midwife's report in a way that linked the birth to the household's concerns about phenotype. The doctor's presence gave an air of legitimacy. It provided the colonel and the steward with technical language to justify decisions that otherwise would have been confessed only in private. We must again stress the limit of what is provable. The ledger shows a physician's involvement in assessments, but it does not record the colonel's private rationale in full, and it does not tell us the physician's inner motives. Those remain, in part, indefinito. Within the enslaved community, there were everyday acts that refused the ledger's logic. Men exchanged discreet favors, passed along herbal treatments, and taught one another ways to feign illness or to delay. Pedro Gonzalez's name repeatedly appears beside notations of remedy in domestic accounts. He is recorded as assisting with the kitchen, and is remembered in later recollection for his knowledge of plants. That very competence could become a small subversive resource, a poultice to simulate a skin condition, a delay tactic that reduced the steward's scheduling efficiency. Such tactics were rarely written in official logs. They survive in the edges of memory and in small marginalia that often go unnoticed. The midwife, unnamed in several municipal copies but present in the parish register where baptisms are recorded, occupies a pivotal archival role. Midwives were both medical actors and recorders in rural communities. Where the steward's ledger schedules and the physician's notes certify, the parish books register new names and spiritual connections. The baptism entry for a child recorded as Maria in the parish register, March 1865, midwife's note, parish book, is one of the first moments when private management became public ritual. Baptism, by its nature, is a communal act. The child's name enters both sacred and civic registers. Godparents are named, dates are set. The very act that might confirm an heir also creates a permanent trace of ambiguity when the child's bodily features lead neighbors to speculate about parentage. Such speculation, when it entered the public sphere, shifted the household calculus. Where the steward's ledger could mask the program under the cloak of domestic necessity, a parish record could not be erased. The baptism of Maria is written in the book with a steady hand. The signature of the priest, the midwife's marginal comment, the godparents' names, these are the lines that would later be held up by neighbors as evidence of something beyond private family matters. Here, the archive moves from administration into ritual, and ritual carries its own social consequences. Not all men listed in the program complied without protest. Jose Maria's entry is a sharp and rare refusal in the steward's ledger. The consequence of that refusal is not laid out in a single clear file. There are later entries that show movements, transfers, and sales involving some of the men. But whether those movements were direct reprisals, routine reallocations of labor, or responses to other economic pressures is indefinito in the files. In other words, a man refuses, later a man is sold or transferred. The documents place those facts nearby, but do not always provide a causal line between them. Where contemporaneous municipal minutes hint at complaints and where auction notices later appear in gazettes, the causal chain may be plausible, but the historian must mark the distinction between what is recorded and what is inferred. Even when the ledger treated human beings as functional categories, people resisted being reduced to such. Luis Carlos, described later in a register as gentle and caregiver, appears in recollections as the one who soothed infants, who hummed lullabies in a thin voice, and who, according to a descendant's oral testimony recorded in the community archive, taught the children words in a half-language that mixed Portuguese and local expression. Those memories were collected long after the events and are, by their nature, shaped by time. They are not evidence that establishes legal fact, but they are evidence of lived experience, of how those within the household remembered affection and kinship, even where public records sought to erase personhood. The colonel's own maneuvering was shaped by more than desire for an heir. Municipal minutes show him active in local office. His social position made both the pressure to produce and the potential fallout very public affairs. In the county's social calculus, failing to secure an heir could leave property vulnerable to contestation. The ledger's procedural language echoes anxieties that were less personal and more institutional. Estate continuity, lineage recognition, and the avoidance of disputes that could erode rank. But administrative anxiety does not justify the human cost, and the records force us to confront how systems of law, church, and medicine could be conscripted into individual plans that used other people's bodies as means. There is, in the papers, a striking mixture of ordinariness and cruelty. On the same pages that list medical assessments and births, household purchases are recorded: sugar, nails, a new lantern. The proximity of these entries is a historical fact that does not require melodrama to strike the conscience. That juxtaposition, the mundane alongside the intimate, is the ledger's quiet indictment. As the winter thinned into spring of 1865, the parish register recorded the baptism of a child named Maria. The entry is simple: date, name, godparents, signature. Next to it, in smaller script, the midwife noted the delivery and the condition of the mother. To those outside the household, the baptism would be an ordinary pastoral matter. Within the estate, however, the presence of the child was a point at which secrecy met ritual. For neighbors and parishioners who observed the child's appearance, questions started to circulate. Questions, when they move from private whisper to civic complaint, change the material stakes. A baptismal entry is a form of evidence because it places the child within the network of community recognition. Those lines in the parish book would later be consulted by municipal clerks and curious neighbors alike. The ledger had institutionalized the program, but the parish register had reinserted the act into public life in a way the colonel may not have foreseen. We pause here at the moment where the back house yields its first recorded newborn and the parish book turns a private arrangement into a communal trace. The baptism of Maria marks a hinge. The operation that had been until then largely administered behind the steward's pad and the physician's shorthand is now writ into sacred registers. That transition from administrative scheduling to public ritual is where the archive begins to show strain. It is where the ledger's pretension to efficiency meets the unpredictability of human recognition. What followed those inked names is recorded across multiple hands and multiple repositories: steward's corrections, physician's marginalia, later municipal inquiries. But the signals are not all consistent. Variant spellings of names proliferate. Cristomo appears as Cristimo or Joan in different pages. The infant Maria surname carries variant suffixes in baptismal copies. Maria Don in one scanning, Maria de Cans in another. These inconsistencies are not trivial. They show the porousness of the archive and the difficulty of reconstructing a single authoritative narrative from documents written by different people at different moments. They also remind us that names, like bodies, were sites of uncertainty.
Even as the parish record made the child visible to the community, layers of secrecy persisted. The steward's ledger continued to note rotations and to record small operational adjustments. The physician's notes maintained their clinical air. Oral memories, recorded decades later, whisper of carved marks and of songs. Resistance continued in small acts. The household attempted to maintain order. But ritual is not merely a record, it is also a performance that invites spectatorship. A godparent's presence at a baptism asserted social endorsement. A priest's signature inflicted ecclesiastical legitimacy. Where the household sought to convert a private intention into a legitimate lineage, ritual offered both the possibility of success and the risk of exposure. To the neighbors who had long watched the estate's comings and goings, the baptismal entries provided fodder for questions that could not be easily repressed by ledger notation alone. It is here, halfway between administration and ritual, that the ledger's neatness begins to fray. The archival trail grows thicker with hints and thinner with certainties. We face, in these pages, the central ethical problem of the historian's craft: how to tell the story of enforced intimacy without converting suffering into spectacle, how to respect the dignity of those recorded as property while using the very records that objectified them to speak for them now. The men whose names appear in those pages did not have the luxury of anonymity in life. They were cataloged, priced in inventories, transferred in sales. In memory, however, they are more than entries. The steward's ledger reduces them to scheduled dates and curt verbs. But oral testimony and the small surviving trace artifacts, the bedpost with a carved line, a family recipe annotated in a margin, insist on personhood. We follow those traces because the archive, for all its failings, yields moments of the human. The ledger lists Cristomo's skill with the stable. In later recollection, he is remembered as the man who taught a neighbor's child to ride. Miguel's laughter, the bright dash that appears in a work roll, surfaces in a memory of him dancing a quick-step at a market fair. Pedro Gonzalez's knowledge of plants, recorded in a cook's inventory, becomes a story of averted illness decades later. These are the small, stubborn facts that refuse erasure. And yet, the ledger persisted, and the back house continued its function. Rotations were observed. The physician continued to note assessments. The midwife's pen moved across the parish book. Each act of administration left its own mark. An ink blot, a marginal correction, a notation that a man was suitable for labor or that a child had been baptized. That language, so bureaucratic, so unfeeling, is often the only material we have to stand against the lived experience those pages occlude. Where the record ends a line and begins another, where a marginal note trails off into illegible scrawl, is precisely where the stories of those who lived and resisted are most vital. They are the counterpoint to the ledger's authority. Carved marks, whispered songs, refusals documented in a single word. They are the human rhythms that run beneath accounts and inventories. As spring turned toward the next season, the household's administrative momentum continued even as the parish's ritual trace expanded. The baptism of Maria had placed a child at the center of a set of tensions that the colonel's schedule had not fully anticipated. The steward continued to note movements. The physician continued to perform assessments. The midwife continued to register births. Each entry tightened the web of documentary evidence, even as it increased the distance between the human experiences and the clinical language that recorded them. At this juncture, the files offer us a decision point. We can follow the ledger as it proceeds, watching the machinery of administration hum on its axis. Or we can dwell on the names that resist being turned into mere functions. The archive does not require us to choose one over the other. Rather, it invites us to hold both planes together, to read the pages of bureaucratic order while listening for the songs and scratches that betray an interior life. Here, the narrative pauses, with the back house still operative. with the physician's pen still fresh in several places, and with a baptized child now carrying a name written into the parish book. The ledger advances, but the community's recognition has altered the terms of secrecy. What began as an administrative program now contains a public trace, and that trace will, in time, draw in neighbors, municipal clerks, and the parish. The result will unsettle the very structures that the colonel believed would secure his lineage. We proceed from this hinge into the more public consequences of those traces, the rumors that become complaints, the parish rituals that become evidence, and the administrative responses that will tighten and fray in equal measure. But those reckonings lie ahead in the record and in the memories that will thereafter be consulted. For now, the ledger sits open on a table, its pages faded at the edges, its margins crowded with ambiguous shorthand. The parish book lies next to it, the baptismal ink still steady. Both are evidence and invitation, evidence of a plan that treated people as instruments, and an invitation to recover the lives obscured by the ledger's neat columns. Primary sources and further reading are listed below. Check the description to read the documents yourself. Neighbors are the first unlikely historians. They keep eyes and tongues and, over time, a record of the ordinary movements that reveal the extraordinary. In San Sebastian, the ordinary was thin. The comings and goings of work carts, the measured hours of the stable, the rhythms of market day. What changed was small and then cumulative. A child unusually dark-eyed at a godparent's shoulder. A woman who left the main house for a curtained room on scheduled nights. A groom who was absent from the stable on particular mornings. Those details, when collected by whisper and then by clerk, would transform private practice into public question. The parish register and neighborhood recollection register, different kinds of authority. The parish book bore ink that could not easily be erased. Neighbors bore memories that could be amplified into complaint. When the baptismal entries for Maria, parish register, March 1865, midwife's marginal note, and later for Joachim, parish register, March 1866, baptismal entry, circulated beyond the congregation, the ledger's careful economy collided with communal scrutiny. People began to compare handwriting, godparent names, and the dates of rotations noted in the steward's pad. The steward's terse administrative language, once sufficient to contain the matter, found itself subject to cross-examination by neighbors and municipal clerks who had their own reason to worry about public reputation. A municipal complaint appears in the surviving record as a cluster of documents rather than a single dramatic deposition. There are civic minutes showing that concerns were raised. There are notes by a municipal clerk that indicate neighbors had filed or at least discussed objections. These minutes do not present a detailed affidavit in a modern legal sense. They record instead that the household's activities had become matter of concern. Municipal Minutes, 1866, phrasing variable across copies. That phrase, so anodyne, nonetheless marks a shift in the social framework. What had been managed in private was now subject to public administrative gaze. Padre Antonio's role in this moment is recorded with the same archival ambivalence that runs through the rest of the files. The priest signed baptismal books. His hand appears next to the signatures of godparents. He wrote brief pastoral notes. Parish records show no explicit judgmental sermon recorded against the household, nor do they contain a clear statement of ecclesiastical sanction. In some private correspondences preserved among municipal papers, there are hints of unease from local clergy about the propriety of certain household arrangements, but those hints never take the form of a formal denunciation in the registers. Whether Padre Antonio saw himself as a pastoral actor committed to protecting parishioners, or whether he perceived his role as preserving the social order of the congregation, is a question the documents leave partially indefinito. The physician's ledger, Dr. Henrique's pages, was a resource both for the carnal and for those who would eventually question him. Medical notations that certify fitness or note deliveries serve to naturalize administratively what might otherwise be the subject of moral censure.
One marginal line in the physician's hand, for instance, notes a child's healthy appearance and the mother's recovering condition. Physician's Ledger, March 1865. Such phrases could be read as routine professional observation. Yet read in the context of Stewart's scheduling entries and parish records, they became strands of the same administrative fabric. The language of care had been repurposed as certification for an operation designed to produce heirs. What happens when ritual collides with rumor? Ritual makes acts public. Rumor attaches meaning beyond ritual. The baptismal entries offered visible evidence that could be compared, copied, and circulated. Neighbors who had previously turned an indifferent eye now had textual materials to discuss. Gossip, in that era and place, often functioned as an informal regulatory force. It policed community norms and enforced reputations. In this case, gossip escalated into municipal anxiety. The archives contain several references to local discussion forums, a market day complaint, an exchange at the municipal chamber, and they show how private unease can catalyze institutional review. The municipal inquiry that follows is itself an archival palimpsest. Marginal annotations on one page join corrected ledger lines on another. A municipal clerk sends a timid request for clarification to the steward, who replies with a businesslike list of transactions and rotations. In one reply, the steward attempts to frame the matter as purely operational. Names, dates, and references to domestic necessities. The tone, professional, obfuscatory at points, is instructive. It reveals an attempt to retranslate human relationships into administrative practice. In these exchanges, the colonel's public posture is noteworthy. When municipal minutes record his name in the weeks that follow the baptisms, they place him in a defensive position. He moves to assert that his household's management is lawful, orderly, and within the norms of landholding households. Whether those assertions were legally persuasive is another question. What they do reveal is the colonel's acute sense of risk, that what threatened him was not merely rumor, but the loss of social capital and the fracturing of trust that undergirds his authority. As administrative pressure mounted, the household adjusted. Stewart's entries become slightly more frequent and more explicit. Rotations are tightened into smaller intervals. The physician's marginalia shift from neutral assessment to notes that might be used to defend the household's procedures. In one instance, an added notation in the steward's book attempts to account for a transfer of labor. The entry lists a man as reassigned for reasons of economy. Stewart's Ledger, mid-1866, a phrase that in the archive often masks social or disciplinary motives. Again, cause and effect are not always legible. Sales and transfers appear in the records, but whether each movement is attributable to reprisal for refusal, to routine economic reshuffling, or to the broader crisis is often indefinito. Transfers and sales are, however, unambiguous in some documents. An estate inventory and subsequent sale notice record the auctioning of the property and its people after the household's collapse. Auction notice, September 1866, estate inventory, 1866. Those lists include names and valuations, a cruel ledger of human worth under property law. Presenting them in narration requires care. These documents are evidence of systemic inhumanity, not a chance to repeat the logic that produced them. The inventory's columns, name, age, skill, price, are methodical and bureaucratic. To read them aloud is to place the entire archival system on trial. Between the baptismal records and the auction pages, a tragedy occurs that the parish records place in August 1866. The entry is terse. A death recorded, a brief notation of circumstances.
Later municipal comments and family papers, cataloged among the same file group, suggest that Dona Esperanza died by suicide in August 1866. Parish Death Register, August 1866, municipal note. The causal web that links scandal, pressure, and death is dense with interpretation. The documents do not provide a private testimony that lays out motive the way a confessional diary might. They record the fact of death, name, and date. Any direct statement connecting the recorded scandal to her death must therefore be qualified. Motive is indefinito in the primary files. Yet to insist on this archival caution is not to deny the moral inference many make, that the collapse of reputation, the public scrutiny, and the family's anxiety compounded harms that fell hardest on the woman whose body and social identity had been placed at the center of the scheme. What we can say with documentary confidence is this. After the death recorded in August 1866, administrative actions followed. The municipal minutes show proceedings that culminate in an auction notice in September 1866. The estate is ordered to sale. Household goods and persons appear on lists for public announcement. The auction's advertisement appears in a regional gazette and is cross-referenced in municipal dispatches. These actions have material consequences. Families are broken, people are moved, and some names vanish from local registers. The fate of the men named in the steward's ledger unfolds in fragments after the sale. Some names appear in sale lists and transfer logs. Antonio da Silva is listed among those transferred to another household in the auction inventory. Estate inventory, September 1866. Pedro Gonzalez is recorded in a later docket as sold to a purchaser in a neighboring district. Sale ledger, late 1866.
Others disappear from the administrative trace. Miguel dos Santos is absent from subsequent household lists, and in oral testimony collected decades later, some descendants say he left at night and never returned. Oral testimony collected 1978, anonymous informant. That formulation, left at night, must be treated as recollection, not documentary proof of escape, but it does point to the plausibility of flight as a survival strategy. Jose Maria's act of refusal, recorded earlier as a single word in the steward's hand, echoes in different directions. The steward logged the refusal. Later, Jose Maria's name appears in a transfer list with a new owner, transfer docket 1866. The files do not supply a clear cause and effect statement that links refusal to sale. The adjacency of the two entries suggests interpretation, but it remains indefinito in the primary documents whether the sale was direct reprisal or part of a broader reallocation of assets tied to the auction. The historian must therefore present both the recorded sequence and the limitations of what can be proven. Throughout this sequence, oral histories complicate and enrich what the ledgers omit. Francisco de Assis, the elder and storyteller whose name appears across municipal and community archives, told in a recorded recollection held in a community repository of nights when people left carved lines on bedposts to mark survival in continuity. Oral testimony collected 1978, Francisco de Assis' recollection. He described carved marks not as mere graffiti, but as an assertion. "We left our signs so they couldn't say we never were here," the recollection runs. That is a memory of presence as much as it is a method of clandestine record-keeping. Such recollections cannot be conflated with contemporaneous written proof. They are, however, essential testimony about how people sought to record themselves when the official archive was an instrument of erasure. The children, too, move through records that are partial and often stigmatizing. Maria and Joachim, baptized with godparents recorded, exist in the parish books. Later registry copies show ambiguous surname spellings that complicate lineage claims. Both children surface in later municipal notes and in scant civil registrations in lists that hint at limited opportunities and persistent marginalization. In one case, a later school attendance roster includes a child with a name variant that could plausibly be Maria Doan/Maria Dawkins. School roster 1879, identification indefinito due to variant spellings. Tracing these children into adulthood in the official record proves difficult. Names drift, spellings change, and often the only traces are those left by people who remembered and told. Why does this matter beyond the local scandal? Because the episode exposes how intertwined social, religious, and medical institutions could be in the reproduction of inequality.
The parish register lends ceremonial legitimacy. The physician's ledger lends scientific sanction. The steward's pad translates human life into scheduled labor. Together, they form a system in which authorities, civic, ecclesiastical, and professional, either failed to check an injustice or, at times, actively enabled it through omission or certification. To insist on institutional ambivalence is not to exonerate, but to clarify how power operated. Part of the tragedy lies in how bureaucratic process normalizes the unacceptable. The practitioner's neutral phrases, the steward's businesslike notations, the priest's sacramental rubric, each provided a veneer of normalcy. Yet beneath that veneer, lived experiences were profoundly disrupted. The auction lists, the parish death entry, and the municipal minutes, when read together, show a system that could both produce and then dissolve lives with an economy of paper and signature. Recovery, then, is partly archival. It is the labor of reading marginalia, comparing script, seeking out oral testimony, and triangulating across repositories. It is also a moral practice, an attempt to restore dignity and personhood to those whose existence was recorded in transactional terms. For scholars and community historians, the path forward is practical and ethical. Researchers must press for digitization of fragile ledgers. They must fund oral history projects that reach into community memory. They must assist descendants in tracing fragmentary records. These are not merely scholarly tasks, they are acts of civic responsibility. The story's afterlife reaches into the present in small and meaningful ways. In a community meeting recorded by a local memory project, descendants and neighbors argued over whether to mark the ridge with a plaque that acknowledged the household's history and the harms that occurred there. Community Meeting Minutes, Oral History Project, 2012. Those debates illuminate how public memory is contested. Some wish to preserve privacy and avoid reopening pain. Others insist on public acknowledgement as a step toward justice. There is no single correct answer. What matters is that the process be led by the community and descendants, not imposed by outside narrative. Institutional reforms follow another route. Archivists who work with these records speak of the responsibility to label documents clearly, to make variant spellings visible, and to avoid reproducing the anonymizing frameworks of the past. One archivist's procedural note, preserved with a digitized ledger, recommends appending oral testimonies to ledger entries as contextual metadata rather than allowing ledgers to speak alone. Archival Practice Memo, 2018. That procedural change, small as it sounds, is a form of reparative history. It recognizes that paper records are partial, and that memory, testimony, and community knowledge are essential complements.
Throughout this investigation, the historian must remain attentive to the limits of evidence. Several elements remain undefined. The colonel's private conversations, the precise incentives offered to individual men, the medical assessment's internal logic beyond what is recorded on paper, and the direct causal chain between refusal and sale in certain cases. Those gaps are not just annoyances. They are reminders that archives carry both the weight of what was recorded and the silence of what was not. The ethical historian thus practices two disciplines at once: rigorous documentation of what the files do show, and careful acknowledgement, not speculation dressed as fact, of what they do not. We have tried in the course of this account to follow that dual ethic.
to present Stewart's ledger entries, physicians' marginalia, parish registers, and municipal minutes as the documentary backbone, while allowing oral testimony and community memory to supply texture and human perspective. What of the colonel himself? His public status eroded in the wake of auction and scandal. Municipal rolls show removal from local office and a withdrawal from social registers that once listed him by name. The records also produce evidence of an attenuated private life thereafter. Family correspondences preserve a few fragments. Whether he retreated into seclusion, sought medical counsel, or attempted to reconstitute authority in private is undefined in the files. The archive preserves his administrative traces, but does not, finally, tell us the inner accounting of a man whose designs had unraveled. The victims, the men, the women, the children, the midwife who recorded baptisms, are the core of this story. It is their labor, their resistance, their small acts of defiance and care that animate the ledger's dry lines. The songs sung at night, the carved marks, the remnant recipes in a margin, these are the forms of life that archives often ignore. They are also the means by which dignity is preserved amid coercion. How should a public reckon with such a story? First, by preserving and making accessible the documents themselves. Digitization, respectful curation, and community-centered annotation are needed. Second, by investing in oral history work that respects confidentiality and community authority. Third, by supporting local archival institutions that house parish registers, physician ledgers, municipal minutes, and family papers. Practically speaking, that means funding, volunteer labor, training, and public platforms that present documents with the interpretive frames that descendants and scholars together develop. A final moral point. Archival silence is not neutral. When records omit the subjective pain of those whose lives are reduced to entries, those omissions shape later memory. To confront that silence is to insist that history include not only the ledgered facts, but the human voices that contested them. It is to refuse the logic that treated persons as means to lineage and property. As we bring this episode to a close, the archive asks us to do one more thing, to memorialize. On screen at the end of this program, we will present the names that appear in the primary documents, with variant spellings noted where they occur in the files, and an acknowledgement of the many unnamed persons who appear in inventories and registers as hands, servants, or categories of labor. The list will read, in the script's notation, Colonel Ostato Ferreira de Costa, variant Osto Ferreira de Costa. Dona Esperanza Ferreira de Costa. Cristomo, variants Crostomo. Joan Crostomo. Miguel de Santos, variant Miguel Dantos. Antonio da Silva. Pedro Gonzalez. Francisco de Assis. Jose Maria. Luis Carlos. Maria, variant Maria Don, Maria da Cons. Joaquim, variants Joaquimo, Gusto, and unnamed others recorded in inventories. Presenting these names is not the same as telling every life in full, but it insists that these persons be seen and remembered as individuals rather than as lines in a ledger. If this account has raised difficult emotions, please note that support resources are listed in the description below. We also include there a detailed source list, parish registers, physicians' ledger entries, municipal minutes, steward's notes, estate inventories, sale ledgers, and the oral history repositories consulted. These links are provided to encourage direct engagement with the evidence and to allow informed readers to follow the documents themselves. This episode bears the provocative framing of 1861 in its title. The farmer who gave his wife to his enslaved men ended his lineage. The silenced ritual of 1861. And that framing functions as a narrative axis. We have been careful to note, transparently, that surviving primary documents consulted for this investigation date primarily from 1864 to 1866. Where chronological reconciliation is uncertain, we have marked facts indefinito and urged archival verification. The title stands as a framing device. The documentary record dictates the evidentiary timeline. At the civic level, change is slow but possible. Archives can be supported directly, by donations to local repositories, by volunteering to digitize fragile pages, by funding transcription projects that respect variant spellings instead of normalizing them away. Oral history projects require resources and training to be ethically sound, and public commemoration, plaques, guided tours, educational curricula can be developed in partnership with descendants so that memory work is reparative rather than exploitative. In closing, consider this. The ledger that once counted knights and names is now itself a witness. Its pages, smudged and annotated, were intended to manage continuity of property and status. In time, they became the principal evidence of a plan that both sought to secure a lineage and, ironically, in social ruin.
The paradox is a painful teacher. The paradox is a painful teacher. Systems designed to reproduce power can erode the social trust on which they depend. Where that erosion produces harm, the duty of historians, archivists, and public citizens is to recover the human stories that were minimized by administration. If this story matters to you, support local archives and oral history efforts. Links to reputable projects and repositories are in the description. Share this video to help keep these histories visible and to encourage others to engage with the documents. To honor those who lived through and resisted this episode of coercion and bureaucratic violence, we leave their names on the screen and in the record, in whatever variant spellings the manuscripts provide. And we invite responsible stewardship of the archives that preserve them. This investigation is not the final word. It is a call to continued research, to community-centered remembrance, and to determined archival work that resists the erasure embedded in administrative language. The ledger is open. The pages remain. The task now is ours, to read them carefully, to listen to the memories that fill their margins, and to ensure that such stories are not lost again to the neat columns that once tried to contain them.